Andreas, you've got the first point. Take it away.
Yeah, so that was a good introduction, Andrew, into Tamland. So I'm basically learning Tamland, and I'm really enjoying that. It's a really good tool, and I started to, look into the parameters that we want to add. So we're starting to want to override some parameters at different levels, and I started to look into this and sort of maybe got a bit excited about that, and wanted to run a couple ideas around that by you and see what you all think. I likely have a lot of gaps, so please point them out as well. And like Andrew said, like we also want to use Tamland for dedicated later on. And there's also talks about using it possibly for runway. So there's lots of opportunities to think about Tamland as a kind of a library or a tool, and sort of think about the inputs and outputs of that tool. And when we talk about those parameters, an example is we want to be able to change the forecast horizon for a particular forecast, right? So that might happen on the saturation point. So we might want to say that all integer 4 capacity forecasts should have a longer horizon, for example, right? And then we also want to be able to override those settings on a service level or a service and component level. So we want to say that for a particular Patroni service, that forecast should be even longer or different, right? So there's different levels of overrides that we would like to make. And I was wondering where we actually want to store those or that information. And right now it's a bit of that is in Tamland itself. So there's some YAML files with overrides there, and other stuff lives in the runbooks repository. And what Bob and I talked about today was to actually try to move that stuff into the runbooks completely. So basically, there should be a single JSON file we can think of as a parameter to Tamland. So that has all the things that we want from Tamland. This is the input, and that could come from the runbooks as we have that today. And I can quickly share my screen and show that if you like. So this is the example that we have. So this is what we have today. This is Tamland JSON.NET and the runbooks. And what we're talking about is adding more information to that. And we can possibly refactor that a little bit, but sort of having the opportunity to add those overrides. So for example, we can override forecast days for a particular component and service. We can add events, like we talked about, annotating the history and saying like, this is where we did a Postgres upgrade, for example, and all those things, and generate that JSON file as input for Tamland. And I was wondering if that's the right place to put that for starters.
So this is very similar to what I felt for a long time. Like, I think this is kind of something if we did internally, it would really help us. But the way I'm going to describe it, it sounds like it's for other people, but it's not. So imagine we were building Tamland as a general tool that like any person in any company could use, right? Mm-hmm. And it had basically a binary that ran, but it had a configuration. And that configuration was completely decoupled from Prometheus. Like the problem at the moment is that nobody else can use it because it requires like your Prometheus to be set up with all these rules and all of that. But imagine like every single like resource in Tamland was a definition, and you could have like a YAML file, or in your case, you said a JSON file that's like, there's this resource and it's 90 days, and maybe there's defaults for some of those values, but you can also override them on a per resource basis, right? Mm-hmm. And then in our case, like we wouldn't maintain somebody at another company who wants to use it, or maybe someone in the runway team could just have a very simple YAML file with like, or JSON file that's really static with like 5 things in it, and it never changes. But for GitLab.com, we're kind of beyond that scale. So we would generate that file from our service catalog and the metrics catalog and all of those things together. And we could generate that file in exactly the same way we generate like rules for Prometheus. Like we don't maintain those manually anymore because we've grown out of that scale. but other people, in other companies that are smaller could just maintain that manually, but it's not a requirement. And then, like literally everything's in there. Nothing is inferred from Prometheus. You could even go as far as saying, the query that you're going to use to get your history is the following query. And in our case, we would always use the utilization ones, but literally there's nothing in Tamland that implies like this is the structure of your data. Like all of that is in the YAML file.
Andreas,
That's
I think what Andreas is going to show is like that's what we're working toward. But I think that last, like the piece that Andrew is now mentioning, where we don't, like right now, Tamland assumes that you will have a metric that is available, GitLab component saturation, blah blah blah, and then we paste in whatever name that Tamland gives. I think the first iteration that'll remain the same.
Yeah.
But I like where Andrew is taking this, where that's actually part of this tamland.json configuration file. So then we just get a bunch of queries. Yeah. So each service component thing that you mentioned will have its query to execute, and that's the result that we're going to be storing and working with.
Like a good test would be, can somebody from a completely different company take this and generate a Tamland report without like spending months getting like our recording rules in, right? Like, but just on their data. Like it's the use case is a bit silly because that's not what we're intending it to be for, but I think that it will force the right structure on us, like if we go down that route.
I mean, conceptually, even Prometheus wouldn't have to be the data, the only data source.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we think about it in terms of abstractions, we have some sort of interface for data that we sort of import or whatever we want to structure that like. And even if in practice it's always going to be Prometheus, I think that's still a useful mindset.
Totally.
That's we have part of that already. Like the interface for generating the report and so on, that's all done from Parquet files, but it's based on the query still. But that
nice.
Something that reminds me a little bit of that is OpenSLO, right? Which is a kind of a YAML file, and I do think that YAML might be a little bit more kind of industry standard, no matter what you think of YAML. But OpenSLO, it's like a YAML file, and then inside there it's got a query, and it doesn't matter whether that query is for Datadog or for Prometheus or whatever. It's just a query, and the way that you interpret that is kind of dependent on the data source.
Currently, Tamland does load data, and
it'll probably have to have adapters to fetch Parquet files
like
or whatever they are, right? But yeah.
No, I think Tamland can build the Parquet files, but it has to have an adapter to fetch to build them, and then it uses whatever that query is as a cache key, like we do now. But it doesn't need to care where that data came from.
And just like on the case of dedicated, like I was actually thinking, if we're going to start using this dedicated, we're going to need like 9 months worth of data, but we don't have anywhere to store that data at the moment. And I was thinking we could just start storing it in Parquet files and actually use Tamland directly from that, because we don't really know where else to store like all of that data for the dedicated customers yet. So it kind of ties in with that conversation a little bit as well.
Great. And can we add those things to the Tamland JSON file, or should there be a different place for capturing those parameters for now, for starters?
What do you mean currently for the parameters we want to adjust?
Yeah, like in this example, right?
Yes. Well, you know my opinion, so I mentioned to Andreas that having a single file that is the input to Tamland is, I like this ID, and then we can add, as you can see in the example here, we can add these overrides and use those to place annotations on a graph and so on. Those will be different for whoever or whatever is using Tamland, if it's dedicated or if it's another customer.
But I think that the definition itself that Tamland consumes should be anemic, right? It should be like JSON or YAML, not JSON. It shouldn't directly consume JSON, right? Like it should be a completely anemic format.
Yeah, but we generate it from JSON because
because that's how. But if someone else wants to use Q or hand coded or whatever, that doesn't matter.
And that's how this works already today, right? So we use that JSON file, and this is the saturation JSON that comes out of it, and that's what Tamland already uses. So that's easy to add.
Awesome.
Cool. And
one thing to maybe call out specifically is we already have things that dedicated reuses in the runbooks, and it would be nice to be able to keep that separation. So I showed you the GitLab metrics config thing. That is overridden in both. So because we use JSONit, it would be nice if we can use GitLab metrics config to get like the specifics, because then potentially dedicated could use the same kind of file that is from their own metrics config. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. All right, and then what I was playing around with going further was to introduce a kind of a data model in Tamland for that input. So today we basically more or less passing around dictionaries, which is fine, like it works. But the more complexity I think we have in those overrides and where things are coming from, I think the more we will benefit from adding a data model. And I played around with that a bit today, and it is just really just making things a bit more explicit, like adding data classes and sort of representations for that information. So we can parse it from the JSON. We can be very explicit about where those overrides are coming from and sort of produce a result that gets more testable, I think, in the end. And we get the benefit of passing around those components in the forecasting code.
I agree. Another thing to look at, it might not work in your case, but it works very well for dedicated, because we have this thing called a tenant model, which is a big blob of JSON that describes like everything about a tenant. We use JSON schema. And that's basically our first level of validation. So that's, basically everything in there describes, this is an integer, it's between this and that. What we found is that JSON schema is very expressive, and it's really nice because when you start typing out the JSON, you get all the autocomplete and everything like that, kind of for free. I mean, with Python, it's not as bad, but what we found was we were using JSONit to validate the JSON, and JSONit's actually kind of uniquely awful at doing data validation for some reason. So having that layer of JSON schema in front really helped us. But use it, don't use it, take a look at it.
Yeah, thank you. And we're using that for Runway as well. Nice.
That's right.
Cool. And then I thought a bit about the sort of how Tamland processes all of that. So today what we have is a sort of Jupyter notebook, and we generate those notebooks based on a few templates that we have. And then we execute a Jupyter notebook and get back those forecasts. In a sense, I think we're kind of mixing the forecast generation, so using profit and all those inputs and getting the data and producing the forecast. We're mixing that a bit with how we want the output to look like, right? So what we later on deploy to pages is basically the output, and that's coming from the Jupyter notebook. And I was playing around with that a bit today, and I thought perhaps it would make sense to split it up in different parts so we can decouple that. So what I looked at was basically, first of all, just plain Python, just generate all the forecasts, and you end up with, let's say, a data dictionary with all the forecasts and those familiar looking graphs, and maybe some YAML files or JSON or whatever that contains all the the results of the forecast. And then based on that, as a second step, you can do, you can generate output for GitLab pages, however that works. You can manage the capacity planning issues and all that. So kind of decoupling that, making that easier to work with. Unless we have a real desire to use Jupyter notebooks, which I wasn't sure about.
It was, I can actually tell you the historical reason why it was based on Jupyter notebooks. Was because I got this really weird OKR to show that GitLab had this very brief time where we had this integration with Jupyter notebooks in the application, which wasn't really an integration. And I had a weird OKR to show that it worked. And so I kind of twisted around that OKR to start building timeline. So it was kind of like the horse lead, or the cart leading the horse, or whatever. And it was kind of to show that the integration worked, but also it kind of helped us bootstrap it because it was a lot less work. But like, there's no reason to keep that.
And even if we wanted to have something more interactive in the future, we could still use all that code and just expose that as a Jupyter notebook. So you could still do that. Cool. And I ended up, so I got really excited about this today. So I ended up playing around with Markdown templating and what we could generate from that information. So remember that we have sort of generated all the forecast information separately, and then we could perhaps consider plotting or generating pages in a different way. And what I ended up doing was using MakeDocs for that. It's just, simple Markdown framework, and you could have
already made it prettier than an hour ago.
It's just a different theme.
No, you've got folders now.
Oh yeah, there's a bit of structure there. That's true. You can do, you can get a service overview. There's something we have today as well, and then what we don't have today is an ability to go into more detail. So you could add a detail page. You could still see the graph. You could still see the forecast configuration. We had sometimes a need to look at sort of or in a debug way, look at the forecast with change points, trend line. You can add that there. And we could even have, the events that we captured. So knowing that something happened on a particular date is something we could describe. And we could even I don't know, scrape the issue tracker and find all the capacity planning issues related to that component that we know of, that we had in the past. So it kind of gives us a more flexible way of working with the data that we have and sort of plotting the things that we're interested in, or adding more overviews in a sense. You could also have an overview
when you're talking
site
about it like this, I think part of this doesn't belong in Timeland anymore. I like that you can print, that we still have access to all of this information, that we can show it on a single page. But for example, the issues feels like something, separate.
But again, if you go back to that thing that I mentioned previously, right, where you want to kind of completely decouple Timeland from GitLab. So maybe Timeland can produce the forecasts, and then there's another tool after that which kind of takes the forecasts and implements it in that way.
The violations of the YAML and the SVGs and stuff.
Yeah,
and
like
the dates.
the data. Yeah.
And then we can take that and whatever, generate whatever we need to from that information.
Yeah, because all of the stuff you're describing would be very GitLab specific. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have the tool Timeland that is from a different repository, Timeland library, let's call it, and then or Timeland, what is currently the Timeland repository that puts issues in capacity planning and hosts this pages site, uses Timeland library, and then it has a tool after Timeland library that generates a pages site. Maybe. I'm just brainstorming, just don't take anything for granted.
Yeah, sounds really good. All right, thank you. That's all I had. That's great input, and I'll try to summarize that a bit better in maybe an issue or two. Dave, do you want to verbalize the section there?
I don't know that I can verbalize it as well as what's written down by what Andrew added there. So I think it covers everything on the chain of thought. Like I joined a few minutes late there, so I initially heard you all talking about generating things in SLO, and I remember Nick mentioning sloth. So I was like, oh, I'll just note it, but I don't know there's much else to say other than what's typed there. So because I agree. So I just was out of context. So unless Bob or Andrew, you want to add anything, I think what you typed is good. So
Sloth is super cool. It's the metal mats. I think Bob, you met him at PromCon. He runs it. It's an awesome project. But like, you know, we've been iterating on our SLOs for so long to kind of readapt.
It would be a significant
something like
change.
that. It would be a massive amount of work to kind of bring back the same level of stuff that we have. I mean, it's not impossible, but it would be big.
We'd have to decide we wanted to do it. Yeah.
Generating the OpenSlow format though, like that's just a YAML file, and it has support for sloth in theory. So, and that's not like, I spent like 2 hours on it to a couple of months back, and that's like, it's not impossible if we really wanted to.
It's like all the extra stuff, like, you know, the tooling, you know, the kind of the tooling links in the dashboards, right? And like obviously the alerting and the error budgeting side, because they're, you know, and the aggregation of the error budgets, right? All of that stuff, and the aggregation sets and all of that. Like it's a very long tail of stuff.
That makes sense. Cool. But yeah, trying to join with my time of day. I think if we're okay, I'll move to the other things. Just brief observability updates. We're looking to do the Elastic upgrade for the prod logs cluster this weekend. I'm working through the change issue. Thank you, Stephanie. I don't think you've even had a chance to look at it, but Steve added a lot of comments already for what we're trying to do. But it turns out the in-place upgrade may be the easier thing to do. So we're ready to try to click the button this weekend, but just trying to check all the boxes on it and make sure we're set. But it helps us unblock. If we can get to Elastic 8.7, then we can do some other things with the hardware on that cluster to deal with some of the saturation we've been seeing. And then Nick's one part of what he's trying to do to wrap up the quarter was to add proper OAuth 2 proxy for credentials for remote write, because right now we're just doing basic auth for what we did for code suggestions. But to make remote write ready for everybody, we want to add the OAuth 2 proxy stuff and what's in that epic. So he'll be working on that. But then other than that, just noting that he's also totally ready to help you, Stephanie, as we start to look at moving some of the rule stuff to Thanos, because that's a big step for us in making Prometheus more efficient. The Prometheus nodes in prod are as big as the database nodes for Patroni. And we need to do something to make that better. And so much of that is because of the high cardinality metrics and the rule processing. So whatever we do there will help us both save money and make it easier to deal with rule processing in the future. So
regarding that, is the plan, so if we move rule processing, if or when we move rule processing to Thanos, is the plan to keep the Prometheus setup with the sidecars, or do we plan to use remote write for that?
Plan to use remote write.
Sounds cool.
And then actually even the rule processing, the rulers themselves in Thanos could use remote write, and then we can horizontally scale the rulers in Thanos much wider than we currently can right now.
Do we need to, I think maybe, I don't know if this has been discussed with Nick, but how do we see the scaling for Thanos ruler? Is that going to be like functional sharding, or
is sharding? Nick has more of it in his head, and I'm working on trying to extract that so I can get back to demoing to you guys. But yes, it can be sharding per tenant. It can be sharding. If we enable the rulers to actually even also use remote write, then we can really horizontally shard, because now I'm writing my metrics out and I don't have to have the recording rules on the same disk as where the ruler is running.
Just as a note for those who aren't Bob and I didn't talk to yesterday, I am trying to come up with to go around and get all the information out of people's heads before they go on vacation, which I have done some of with Bob. I'm also meeting with Nick on Monday. So we're going to come up with a plan. It's going to be a great plan. Like from the side of scalability, the main focus is how do we get metrics that don't have gaps? Like for the purpose of observability is also how do we make it so that we can scale and grow and do all of these things. But at a really high level, we need error budgets not to have gaps in them. So that's the main focus.
But I feel like observability owns the gaps too, because we're we're part of the problem on the gaps. I feel like that's a joint team owns. We want to
absolutely.
make that not happen.
We're also the cause of that because we do lots of the expensive reporting rules. So it's a team effort.
I don't think you can.
But that's what I'm going to say is I see that as a team effort. I don't see that
Agreed.
as just scalability's problem.
Yep.
So that's what I was trying
to
make
absolutely not. Like I'm gonna my plan is, and I know Rachel isn't on here, but I've talked to her about this too. I think we're gonna grab Matt as well once he's done on call. But I think the plan is just get Nick and I and Matt to come up with what makes sense to go forward and execute it.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was trying to note in my preview, and what I had to say for you all here in the demo is I'm holding space on observability's KR next quarter, assuming that there's something that comes out of that to like.
There will be.
This is both an efficiency and reliability of the observability stack improvement that needs to be made. So because having you all have to have a monthly, we're sorry, there's a gap in the metrics for your error budgets reports, like that's not something that's going to be sustainable going forward. So
yeah, and like you said,
easier.
This needs to be able to scale as well.
Yeah.
Like
no, and that's what Nick was calling out to me is like we see that of like if sales is going to be using this too, we need to try to address this now.
Agreed. So. And I know that it's mentioned as a OKR for scalability as well. So it's going to be a joint, or at least in one of the things I haven't looked at all the way through all of my to-dos, there's a notification about OKR discussions for scalability with this one being on it. So yeah. So I guess if anyone has any questions or wants to follow up, there's a big epic that I'm working on refining that I can actually link in this. But I predict the high level is going to be that we end up moving all of the rules to Thanos ruler and do something else with this, but I need to talk to Nick more.
We might also end up changing ratio calculations. So we so we don't have mismatches in numerator denominator.
Correct. That's not really the observability part. That's just we need our metrics. Like we need our metrics to be accurate. And that is the other part of it.
Cool. And there's one other team note. It's not a bad thing, but observability is down to Calliope and Nick. Craig has transferred over to FedRAMP. But on the positive note, we did hire your referral, Andrew, as our third team member. He's starting in October, the beginning of October.
Bob knows him as well. Bob,
you did? Okay. So anyway, I don't know how official, like the contract signed and stuff, but since this is a recording and other stuff, I'm not saying names, but October 2nd is the start date. So we're excited. Like we will be adding that.
I'm thrilled that he's joining. Just going back to the OAuth question.
Sure.
Just on that, like I think the thing that we really would be really nice from the outset is if we can use like kind of OIDC style trust relationships with short-term credentials to authenticate in, and like really kind of on dedicated, we're going to be using this remote write interface quite a lot. And the last thing I want is to manage any type of like long-term keys. Like I want to be able to like all the stuff on dedicated now, we're getting rid of all the long-lived keys for everything, and there's no leaks. Everything is better. And this would be one of those things. It'd be really nice if from the outset we can use like short-term keys and just get a key for short-term and use that key for the remote write and not have to worry about keeping service keys or JSON blobs that are really top secret anywhere.
Okay.
And specifically doing that from AWS as well.
Okay.
So,
no, and that was the whole reason we wanted to make sure we finalized, because right now it's just a basic auth, because that was like, we need to get this done for code suggestions in May, and we're like, okay, basic auth it is, but we were circling back. So I just linked, it's the OAuth 2 proxy thing that I just linked. That's what we're looking at using. I'll make sure I message, I can try to get that back to Nick. So whatever we do there.
My experience with OAuth is kind of it's it's user to, and this is just maybe my experience, but user to service, right? Where a lot of OIDC is like service to service with short-term credentials and trust relationships. But I'm presuming, you know, Nick's, I'm sure that what he's got here can obviously support service to service, because that's like 19, well, all of the traffic that's going to go through remote writes is not going to be a user doing an OAuth exchange.
Nope. Yeah. This will be generating it for a service. And that was the last piece of what we were a little hung up on and waiting to sync with Foundations on, is one of the things before we thought too deeply about it, that is the problem, is like we really wanted to use Vault and be like, hey, everybody use Vault, but Vault's not exposed externally for those things in AWS.
Yeah, we can't use Vault.
We can't use Vault.
It's got to be OIDC. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why we were like, we took some time in trying to evaluate what's in that epic. And I'll circle back because I know Nick was meaning to add a note to the epic that I linked there with what we were choosing and some of the design on that. So let me make sure that that gets added. But that was one of those things, like we're in trying to wrap up this quarter, just letting you know what we were having people focus on. So
Andrew, because you mentioned remote write in the context of dedicated now, I was wondering if there's already a plan to have like a single pane of glass for metrics for dedicated, like not the
it won't be all, it'll be like, it won't be all of, we're not going to like write all of the metrics from the instance. We're going to kind of maybe utilization, saturation, and kind of headlines, and send those somewhere. But you know, not everything, but basically a subset. It's not going to be the whole Prometheus. It's like literally a set of recording rules, probably. I mean, even then, I kind of have concerns around like the cardinality of it.
Stuff
yeah, because I mean, you know, when we get to 100 customers and we have 100 IDs in those, is that going to be something we can do? So, you know, there is a kind of question.
Have you seen what Prometheus looks like for GitLab.com? And you're asking about a series that has a cardinality of times 100. Andrew, come on.
Yeah, we'll just have to make sure that everything's nicely rolled up before we send it. Then 100's fine. Like, we just, as long as we don't have like any node names or anything in there as well.
Well, again, that's part of what the flexibility of remote write gives us, is because if we decide to implement different Thanos backends underneath that,
yeah,
you know, this is where we can do a bit of a magician behind the scenes of actually there's 3 different Thanoses that remote write is accepting and writing to. If we had to do something like that, again, this decouples some of how that works, and we might be able to do something like that. This is me speaking at a really abstract level, so I don't know if that's totally right, but we hope that that pattern is what could be useful for us.
Have we got any time left in this demo? Because if you do, we're just talking about OAuth, and I just wanted to maybe show this little thing that I built for dedicated, but I just realized it might be useful for other people as well. And it's
always happy to see
a rough ass demo, so let's do it. It was kind of, Igor and I were talking about Runway and OAuth and authenticating users against a GitLab instance yesterday. And I suddenly realized that there's a bunch of stuff on dedicated where we want to talk to a GitLab instance, and you have to have a GitLab token set up. So that means creating a long-lived token, which is kind of like the enemy of everything at this point. And then doing an export GitLab token equals whatever, and then using that token, which is really, really horrible. And after the discussion we had, I was like, wait, we can just use OAuth for this. And so now if I'm working on my computer, let me just share my screen.
It means you need to set up an OAuth application though, right?
It's done. There's a single application for it. So we use this thing called PMV. I'm just going to use, because I've got this one here, and it's kind of like a tool for kind of on your computer getting hold of secrets without like having them written in files, which is very important for dedicated because we don't want people accidentally leaking things. But what's kind of useful is like if I need a GitLab token now, I don't have to go and create one under my accounts and then, you know, export it, and, you know, then it's in my bash history, and, you know, who else knows where. I can just do this. I'm just going to change this to that. And what this is going to do is, whoops, that's too quick. So let me try to do it again. I need to bring this whole screen over here. Let me do this. So I just run that, and it logs into GitLab. If I'm not logged into GitLab, I'll have to do an Okta OAuth, and then, I've got if I do like a curl at this point with a GitLab token, that will now work. So I've got in my environment, I now have a GitLab token that was exported by PMV via that OAuth process. So I can just do that, and it's me. So, and that token will last for 2 hours, and then we can throw it away. So if you find that you often need GitLab tokens, go and look at PMV, and it's got this thing called GitLab Env. It's also got like useful tools for fetching things from 1Password and injecting them into your environments. But that might be useful if you're looking at using OAuth or using tokens with GitLab and you don't want to stick them on your machine.
Andrew, I just
yeah.
had a thought. We should probably put this into GitLab or whatever the new GitLab CLI is going to be. This seems like something that should be in the official GitLab client.
So the problem then is, well, we could do that if we made the that's a very good point. We just have to make the application configurable, because we wouldn't want everyone to authenticate against our PMV application, right? But yeah, 100% agree. I might open an issue about that. I've got several open issues on GitLab at the moment. Cool. Thanks, Siegel.
Can't that be a local host application?
So it's just as which the application is set, so the callback is localhost, and it just creates a server while it's running, and then when GitLab finishes its authentication, it jumps back to localhost, gets the code, does the exchange, and then exports the token to the environment through the the eval over here. So I could.
So what's the part that doesn't fit into GitLab?
So when it works at the moment, I'll just show you the part that doesn't fit into GitLab is that it's at the moment it's a
application ID.
It's got an application basically hard coded,
yeah,
which is the PMV application in infrastructure. Yeah, so this is this client. So this client ID over here is, and that's not a secret, so don't worry about that. It's just an identifier. Oh, and that would help as well, wouldn't it? Thanks. So if you go look in here, sorry. So there's this client, this application that we define, and the secret we don't actually use, because we're using this newer kind of OAuth that doesn't require the secret, but we've got the application ID, and this is defined once off. And so if we did that, I think what we'd want to do is allow GitLab to pass in the application ID rather than have it hard coded like it is over here. Because then the user of GitLab would need to create an application for OAuth and then pass that identifier in, where at the moment it's just static, if that makes sense. But that's a good idea, Igor.
Got it.
Anything else?
Does GitLab have a thing, and not GitLab, but PMV could have a thing that it can parse like an environment file where we say, I need a GitLab token, I need this token, this token, this token, and then like we often have a .env that has some 1Password stuff inside and some, but
so PMV does it a slightly different way, where it creates a 1Password entry that's got like env colon, like the fields have got the environment name of the thing, and then when you export that thing, it just generates, and it's got a way of capturing it in that way, so you can capture keys in that way as well. But it's slightly different because 1Password built in has got what you were describing as well, the 1Password CLI.
And that's what we're often using now, but we define so we manually, however we do it, we create a bunch of tokens, stick them in 1Password, and then we've got an env file that has, well, sometimes it even still has like hard-coded tokens,
Yeah.
The
I
newer
hope
one,
not.
it shells out to development tokens and stuff, no?
Right. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
But I would like the new
Yeah.
suggestions always point to 1Password, but it would be cool if that's just a list of things and PMV can generate it and do the right thing.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I could put that in there as well. Like the other thing that it's the reason why we can't just use the 1Password CLI is we do stuff like we go to the AWS SSO for like, logging into AWS. And obviously 1Password CLI is like great, but it's a one-trick pony. And all this is doing is calling the 1Password CLI. It's not anything fancy. It's just literally executing that. So it's just a wrapper. Cool.
Anybody have anything else they want to share or show? Right, then I'll see you all in August.
Have a lovely, lovely holiday, Bob.
Enjoy.
Bye.